Today's program is called A Reading of New Work, Dine Poetics by Esther Belin. And I'll just read the bio. Esther G. Belin is the author of 2 poetry books and co-editor of the Dine Reader. She teaches in Native American and Indigenous Studies Department at Fort Lewis College and the Low Residency MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Raised in Los Angeles, she learned from the resilient Indian community to transplant and strengthen her Dine worldview. She is, what do you say? Cloget, born Bertocchini and lives just east of the mountains on the Colorado side of the Four Corners, and also poet laureate of Durango, right?
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to be showing you some work, starting off what I've been doing first, and I have a PowerPoint, and I don't know why. I think, well, we've been working all week with the Ocheti Shakowin Writers Society, and it's been really fulfilling to be working with other Native American writers and to see how language and just history and experience have really kind of culminated into what we're calling, I guess, literary arts and literary sovereignty, and really defining those words, and really just want to take time this morning to acknowledge who I consider our earliest writers, who are the boarding school students who, in the late 19th century were in classrooms just like this, not as a comfortable or conducive environment, but very coerced, a lot of fear around that emotionally, but really, having to squash their indigenous epistemology, right? Their thought systems, their knowledge ways into this new way of learning. And so really just take time to honor those writers, because we are now finding many of those early writings in United States archives, because they were not considered literature, number one, but also were really considered propaganda for Congress, other state officials, that the boarding school project was in fact a success. So it's really a different type of archive that we're able now. I mean, anyone really can. And that's the other thing. I don't know if people have worked in archives. It's you have to be committed. The documentation, how things were labeled, just based really off of the person and whether they thought it was valuable, had any worth or not. And so we're now able, I think we have a good body of scholars who are able to go back and kind of dig up some of that writing to see and honor those young ancestors that we had from way back. So just want to do that this morning, and I'll introduce myself in Navajo. Yat bina Esther Belin Yanishia, Kloge Dine Nishlan, Twitchitni Bashichin, Kitlachitni Dashache, Tachitni Dashanala, Akot Ego Dine Astan Nishlan. So, and remind me of your name again. Anne. What Anne read was part of the my first 2 clans, and I'm glad that you stumbled on them, because I think that's a really representative of the exchange that happens, right, when we take indigenous sound and thought and try to squeeze it in to like a foreign system of sounds and thought, right? And there's even anxiety or value or worth on whether I can pronounce those words, right? And I see that I teach also at the Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, and so I really sometimes I'll have students read aloud, and it's interesting, right? Because there's students who have whatever anxiety, fear, shame associated with their ability to read. And so I try to make it more comfortable for them in different ways. But it's just, I think that's a perfect example when we talk about literary sovereignty or about what occurs many times when we have anybody who's been othered in the United States because of language or culture, and they try to write in English. And they try to bring in those writing systems. And so I think poetry is a very natural and very fun way to incorporate otherness is almost like accepted, right? Like if you are creating a new form of poetry or experimenting, it's generally very welcomed. So I think poetry is a really nice way, a nice vehicle. And poetry was one of the first writing systems that were introduced to Native American students. And I really feel that it was because they, I don't know, I had the feeling that, the instructors thought, well, poetry is simple. You just have to rhyme, and you just need like a few lines, and it's just, simple sentence structure. But what these students took and did with that structure was, what I've been talking about the last couple of minutes. I mean, you read these very short poems generally, and just the thought and the intentionality comes out on the page. And these were young students, primary school age. So I'm going to start showing you what I've been doing more recently. Oh, and thank Sarah I have so many helpers today. Acknowledge Sarah and some of the members of the Ocheti Shako and Writers Society. We have Patty and Chris and Debbie over here, and our other helper, assistant Pam, who's out at the table. And so we've been having these conversations for a long time. And a long time, I think, as isolated communities. And now we're finally at the point where we can come together as communities to really kind of share that knowledge. And so this is, I've been recently so I'm also an artist. I have done a lot of two-dimensional stuff and getting more into, my late husband was a sculptor. And so I started, anybody familiar with Gestalt, right? I've started like all this unfinished business, like his sculptures that were in progress. I'm like, I gotta finish them. So it's so bizarre. It's like a really interesting process I'm on. But working with artists, and one of the latest projects I was working on was around this Fort Garland in Colorado, which is right on the border of New Mexico. So if you're at the fort and really you just look south, there's not a marked border, but it's New Mexico right there. It's like very close. And that mountain in the background is called Cisnajina, and that's one of the Navajo people's boundary mountains. That's like our boundary mountain in the east. So we have 4 mountains that we really kind of consider our boundaries for our homeland. And this particular fort, it opened, you guys can read, it really operated only for a short while, but it housed the African American G Company of the 9th Cavalry Regiment, known as the Buffalo Soldiers. And so this was a unique gathering of people at this fort for a short time, right? So we had indigenous people, and if you're familiar with the history of Southwest, through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there were also a lot of Latino folks in the region through given land grants, and then there's Indian Pueblo, like Taos is really close, and the Utes at that time were very much nomadic, so really up and down that valley, as well as even the Comanche kind of came in, Arapaho, and then of course Navajo, and then we have a fort. So we have a whole mix of people in that time. And one of the things I also like to talk about is that that particular fort, I think or through the fort, or either like 10 miles west of the fort, was part of the old Santa Fe Trail. And so for folks who know the significance of that trail, it started in Santa Fe, ended up in Los Angeles. And it was primarily, for trade, but at that time, very much part of the commodity were women and children. And so it's very well documented about the Indian slave trade in that area. So it's not uncommon that young Indian women and children were taken through that area. And also at that fort, later Kit Carson was sort of the Army official who was spearheaded the roundup for the Navajo people and led them to their prison camp. So, and then he lived there at that fort for a few years, and they have photos of his adopted kids who were all Navajos. So it's just, there's so much tangled history about that fort. And so the museum director called a bunch of artists and writers in to write about this, to present on this. And so this is a little bit of the artist statement, and I'll just read this a little bit. When I approached this project, I had difficulty positioning myself in this documented narrative from approximately 145 years ago. This was the same period that my tribe was recovering from a forced march. And that paraded the people over 300 miles from their homeland to a prison camp called Bosque Redondo. During this time, stories of death were daily occurrences, stories of raids and attacks targeting women for the slave market were common. Few stories of the Buffalo Soldiers exist. So part of our whole purpose here was to sort of uncover and sift through all of this stuff. And so when I started doing that, I imagined my father, an unknowing recruit for the termination and relocation campaign to civilize Indians, struggling in silence, silently tumbling through scenarios over and over, falling into a rhythmic meter of eliminating indigenous cadence and thought and negotiating colonial additives that pose the least harm to tribe and self. And so a lot was happening just in me as the writer, like, can I do this, and what is it going to look like, and kind of uncovering a lot of emotion around this really important project. And so this is a photo. The black man on your right is John Taylor, and he was a Buffalo Soldier who later befriended the Ute people and married into the tribe so he was able to speak Ute. And on the right is one of the leaders at the time of the Ute people, Buckskin Charlie. And so they were friends and leaders as the Southern Ute Reservation was being formed. But the interesting thing about John Taylor was he was so included and accepted into the tribe that he actually obtained a tribal allotment. So he was the only I don't know the only, but he had a tribal allotment and he has descendants there. So this was the call for the Buffalo Soldiers, a recruitment call. Indian fighters volunteer for the U.S. Cavalry. And so this is the call that many soldiers post-Civil War answered. This one was specific to Black soldiers and how there was a lot of protection, supposedly, like if they decided to enlist, that they would provide protection for them. One of the things, very interestingly enough, was that they mandated was once the soldiers were enlisted, they were required to learn to read and write. So they usually had some kind of clergy man there to help them read and write, become literate. And this is an actual photo, a stereograph photo of the fort. And so you see the soldiers there, and overlaid is one of the correspondents with the fort on trying to get Black soldiers out into Fort Garland. And so you could see it more clearly on the bottom one, where they're designated at Fort Garland as the point to which 60 recruits for the 9th Cavalry will be sent. And so one of the things, especially when I was working on this, and I thought about these men who were, had this very recent history of being enslaved, military experience, and then they come out west, right? So a lot of their experience was like south, southeast, but definitely eastern. And what would that experience be to coming out, like if anybody's been out like New Mexico area, southern Colorado, it's just like open and it's dry and it's got a high elevation. So it's kind of like a mountainy desert versus where they're coming from, right? Southeast, very humid, lush, water, totally different environment and totally different relationship of looking at the land. So their history was they're working the land, dying for land that was never theirs. They saw very little profit from that. And then, here they're over here in the West thinking like, why are these Indians fighting for this land, right? Like, why does this land have so much meaning, right? So they intentionally separated the groups. And so I started writing this postcard series of fictional of Buffalo soldiers writing to relatives back home about what this experience is like, just to kind of get into that emotional context of what's happening here, right? And this one says, "Dear Nettie, I'm unable to describe the majesty of this land and the grandeur I have witnessed. Indians are a mighty, brilliant spectacle. They fight with the freedom spirit. Being perplexed to no freedom, I sometimes feel desolate and alone." This other one says, "I do earnestly desire to talk the Indian language. I want to gain a realizing sense of their world. Do they suffer like those who have been enslaved? How deep and dark and foul is their state of suffering? I wonder." This one's for Charlotte. Dear Charlotte, the Anglo-Saxon says, "Take courage, Willie. Brighter days will come by and by." What does the Anglo-Saxon know about the desires of freedom? What does the Anglo-Saxon know about the turmoil immense as the blowing sand on the plains? I have the last one. Dear Charlotte, the company unit lived together in a barrack separate from the others, and we worked to shield together a comfortable living, but the winter snow and wind cut into any comfort we had thus, and we were desirous of wearing buffalo robes like the Indians. How heartily we laughed. And so a lot of these statements came out of again, the archives. So reading, and not a lot from the Buffalo Soldiers, but reading all of the correspondence from the commanders and lieutenants and whoever about the Buffalo Soldier experience, reading about their experience to sort of extinguish the Indian tribes, reading some newspapers from the time. And then I was like, this is the voice that's missing. And not that I should be the only person trying to do this, but it helped me as a writer and an artist to dive into that context, to have some perspective. And so this is a map of, what a lot of people call the borderlands. So the territory of Colorado, 1861 to 1876. So when we think of New Mexico and Colorado, I mean, they're very young states considering, right? All the other states, the original 12. and so this is a map of that area. And so, I was sitting in on Rachel Crane's talk yesterday, where she was talking about the Homestead Act. And so that was the other thing. So the Homestead Act did occur in parts of Colorado. And so what I did, so this was one of a series of posters that I created for the project, was asking a handful of Native American friends to write about their homeland, write about the connection they have for land. And so I took those descriptions. This is somebody describing their land, a photo, and then basically how it would feel to have that land, that connection that they have for this property, this, homeland sold or just stolen, right? I mean, equivalently, it was around $1 an acre is what land was sold for or taken. And so Rachel did a great job, an amazing job talking about that inherited wealth that many people attained just from that Homestead Act. And so when we understand the distribution of wealth today, it all comes from it's just visual, right? Looking at Indian land today versus non-Indian land ownership. So here's another one. And then here's another one as well. And so people just really talking about their connection to land and what would it feel like if your land was just your dear childhood home, right, sold right from under you. And so this is a map of the original Navajo homeland, where it kind of sits. So it really crosses, I guess, many state lines. And this is a blown up version. So you can see Fort Garland in the sort of kind of middle, almost offset there. And then the routes of the walk where the Navajo people had to walk and were displayed in front of people. So one intentionally went through Santa Fe, so they can be paraded through in front of people. And then when we see the Santa Fe and Fort Garland, the Santa Fe Trail, right? I don't have a picture of that, but you can easily look up that. Like, it just went through Colorado, and it goes through Las Vegas, right? And so when we think of how all these things occurred in these towns, what they're known for, part of that is as a result of that trail. So the other thing that I started doing was to acknowledge missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. So the same group of friends, different friends, I had them write a description of me if I went missing. And these are my silhouettes that a friend took of me. So missing, post, right, to know what that's like. And part of the descriptions, I was like, I want you to tell intimate details like that you knew me, right? So I think when we think of the missing and murdered relatives campaign, most of the time it's sort of just this, well, who are they? I don't know who they are, right? So this project is really to kind of like, you do know who they are, right? They're everyday women, children, other relatives. So here's another. There was, I think, I don't know, 6 of each that I had up. So that is, and this is our, this is where I live near, I don't live in that spot, but that's the northern boundary mountain for the Navajo people. So I just live, I think it said, 20 miles or 15 miles east of there. So I don't live, so this is probably close to 12, 13,000 feet. I'm at like 6,000 where I live, maybe 65. Okay, so that is that part of it. And then any questions about this project or in terms of writing, how the ability to sort of transfer writing over to this type of visual format? Yeah.
Could you just pronounce that word?
Oh, yeah. That's, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
All of these things that you described, are they exhibited at the...
Yes. So if you go to Fort Garland, they have a cultural museum there. And so it was, thank you for that. So I was the only Indigenous artist. There was a white woman, a white man invited, and then like maybe 5 African American artists. And it's interesting, right? Because there were, out of the, 4 of the Black artists, they came from like North Carolina, New York, I think Philadelphia. And so when they came out west, they were just like, they'd never come out here. Like, they were blown away. They were just true tourists. We were going through somewhere and to somebody's house, and it's probably really common out here as well. Like, you're driving on a paved road, and then all of a sudden it turns dirt road, and then it might go paved again. And so that happened. We're driving on the paved road, and then it turned dirt. And we were traveling with the guy from Philadelphia, and he was just like, what just happened? Like, I think we're lost. Like, oh my, we need to turn around. Like, this is, and he had so much anxiety. I was like, you need to go down. Like, right, he just the fact that like going on this different type of road, but we were in the same, we were like, I don't know, maybe 10 miles out of town. It was like, we're, in survival mode. And so it's really interesting, right? How we've acclimated to different things and our comfortability with land. And so that was actually really fun. They did more of their projects on buffalo soldiers. Oh, and there was also a really interesting soldier who was a female, and she joined as a male. And so this idea around identity and gender, and so I wrote a poem in honor of her as well, And I have those displays up there. I have postcards, I have the posters, and there's like 4 rooms of art talking about this particular kind of convergence of people. And
So did those Black artists have any knowledge of the Buffalo Soldiers?
very little. Very little. I mean, and so a lot of, I mean, we all really learned. So it was like a book study. So we read like 3 or 4 books. We dove deep into the archives. So people are like, oh, that's all you did. And it's like, so really it was a 2-year project, and we did like a year just of research, of just getting to know. Because for me, it was so important because it was 145 years ago. So I was like, how do I do something representational? So I wanted to do the postcard series, which was sort of that voice, and then more of the recent issues around like, because there's a lot of conversation around people who are like, oh, the Homestead Act was like, oh, over 100 years ago. Oh, this missing and murder. Like, okay, well, I get it, but I don't get it, right? Like, so really to put context into those 2 things that all are related, right? They're part of that whole sort of cycle of federal policy, value or lack of value on land or contract, military sort of kind of movement in the West, and so when people try to look at things and they're like, well, why is I think Denver, or why do like Denver, some of their towns outside of Denver is like Arapaho. Like, why do they have these names, or why do they have Indian mascots? I think they're kind of eliminating some of them now. And because they're like, there's no Indians around here, right? There's no Indian reservations, true, in that area. But the history, so it's not just random, right? There was a presence there, right? And so really bringing some of those things to light in that. Yeah.
Did you learn anything about navigating archives because they're so overwhelming?
Oh, yeah.
Intimidating, and through all that process, is there a tip that you could take away for somebody entering the archival space for maybe the first or second or third time?
Sure. I think part of it is really, I mean, there's a lot of work on the research, right? You have to want to find. So even finding archives on the Buffalo Soldiers in that area was limited. Like, it wasn't all in Colorado. There was quite a few records in, so the Buffalo Soldiers also went to Wyoming. They were in Yosemite National Park. They were all over the West. And so part of it was then after, I think there was a scholar out of, I don't remember, but I know the book was published out of University of New Mexico Press, and they had a bibliography. And so talking to the researchers, so we had the luxury of working with the director of that Museum and Cultural Center, who's a trained historian. So he put out, so part of it is also, if you're part of a listserv of researchers or historians or colleagues, so we all did that. We all were and so we ended up reading student dissertations from the 1980s that were just sort of hidden, and some were out of NAU, some were at Fort Lewis that were not as well developed, but just little trails here and there. So it takes you all over the place, as you probably already know. And right now, the beautiful thing, I think, with archives is a lot of people are investing time and money to digitize. So that really helps. But even if you do that, you're it just says, I don't know, Southern Colorado, and you're like, wow, what's in here? So just getting to know the librarians is really helpful. And even local, there was a group of local or local historical society club of people who were like, oh yeah, like we had the ranch next to John Taylor, like that black man, and my grandfather knew him, and they had the, so we get these photos, and you're like, wow, right? So people have a lot of great history and personal archives that they don't really know what to do with, right? And so even, starting that process. So there's, not a real key. It's really just the researcher. And so it took time. It took a year to really, where we felt like, okay, we have enough material. Looking at old maps was also really helpful. Oh, and real estate records, which people don't often think of, but how and who were able to purchase. So ironically, Native American people could actually purchase land. Blacks couldn't at that time. And so there were community, so that a perfect example, right? Like in Tulsa, what happened with that town and how there was an exchange, community formed between the Afro-Indigenous, right? So real estate is one that I didn't realize until I talked to a woman from Tulsa who was telling me, and it was another, I don't know if it was a librarian or I sat in on some interesting Zoom about ancestry to Buffalo Soldiers and Cherokee freedmen. And then I was like, oh my gosh. So then I talked to her. So it's just kind of like and sometimes they're not really anything, but sometimes they're like, oh, I never thought of that, how to look. And so it's a lot of work. There's people who work where you're should be able to access certain types of records, depending on who's in charge or how they decided to store. It can be problematic. People are like, I don't know where that's at. You got to give me time. Just everyday county, city workers just not really sure how to get the information to the public. Yeah.
I just want to mention that there were Buffalo soldiers at Wounded Knee when the massacre there, and that's where I learned about Buffalo soldiers was there. And we recently watched a movie about a young black woman who dressed as a man and was on her way to the Southwest.
Yeah.
We talked about that woman. I just wondered if that might have been
Yes.
her life.
I wonder, she's the only one that we know of. And the sad part of it is, right, she, oh my, they walk so much, so they didn't have access. There's these narratives of where the buffalo, at that time, not everybody had horses, I guess, because they talk about how they had to walk 50 miles a day, and just so they had all these health ailments as a result of just really that hard living. And especially her, she had frostbitten some toes. She had another ailment, I think, with joints, and she applied for Army disability, and she was denied. She was denied twice, and it's just just these things of so it's hard to tell the reasons why she was denied, but everything was documented. So the health records of her were pretty well known. I'm not really sure why. But that's the other thing too, right? So she was female and she had all these health records. So did they not do a complete physical? There's so many questions, when people were asking, so really nobody knew she was a woman? So that's an interesting kind of, okay. So I want to now, let's see, I keep using this mouse, which is funny. Okay. I had something else open. Okay. Yeah. So this poem, I want to I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing, but I want to definitely talk about the title. So this was written in a more well-known form called a sestina, which is pretty strict, but it uses 6 words at the last word of each stanza. So remove, spoken, peace, strength, memory, land will be in the following 6 stanzas, but in a different order. And that's the sestina. And then the last line here is combining 2 of the last words into 1 line. And there's a couple different recommended orders. So that's a sestina. But what I really want to talk about was the title. So this is about the Navajo Long Walk, which was that one I was talking about, the prison camp walk. And so I have these sort of suffixes there in parentheses. And so I started doing this with some poem, not all of them, so part of what I've been doing is really trying to get the audience involved in my writing, and on this kick around how we make meaning out of things, and so part of like interpretation analysis. So the title can be multiple things, right? It can be the petition of peaceful maker, the petitioning of peacemaking, the petitioner of peaceful maker, right? So you can use all these ends and how that changes the meaning, right? And so I think that idea that when we start forming thoughts and words, this is one example of that. And then this one too. So I started making visual poems and using the letter X, which is kind of represents the unknown in math. And so then giving meaning, right? So this is the title, X plus X plus X plus X minus X minus X minus X, right? And so this poem is all about this idea of what is happening. So if we have 2 unknown elements, what is happening between the unknown elements? So that's what this poem's about. It's about there are cries between each letter, right? And then this other one, there are seedlings between each letter. And then I start doing more experiential stuff where the audience is like, there are blank, you fill in the blank. What's happening between each letter, right? And then this idea around assessment and value and creativity. Choose the best answer from the list below to fill in the blank, and then write a haiku to support your answer, right? So I'm in education, so a lot of our students, right, are always like, well, what's your answer? Now you need to support it. And so it's always like justifying, like, and not that it's a bad thing, but I think it can get overemphasized, and then your creativity and identity gets sort of flattened out. And students are always asking for extra credit. So then here's the extra credit, right? Like, so map your answer on the graph below. And so part of it, they have to understand what those words are. They have to give meaning to those representations. Right. So these are some of the newer things that I've been using. So writing more in traditional forms and sort of indigenizing that piece of it, because here right here where, so here like where the original was, I guess you can see. So memory, spoken, removes strength, land. So Jane is also a kind of a idiom or a phrase that the Navajo people use, meaning like it was like they said it, right? Like, and usually the they is more like, that's how our Navajo framework, it's according to the Navajo framework, right? Like that's how it goes, right? And so that Jeanette I used for spoken in there. And then that Zil. So this is a good example right here, the next one. So the mountains, the boundary mountains, we say Navajo Zil is mountain. But it comes from Zil, which is strength. So the root words are the same. So then using the Navajo word for strength there. So there's ways that you can kind of mix up, right, that phrasing in there. So I'm doing, using the traditional form, but definitely sort of taking it and, expanding it more for the framework around the Dine. Okay, so I have a feeling we might be out of time. Yeah, okay. Okay, but I know I don't want to disrupt people's schedule if they need to go somewhere else. But so I can hang out for a few more minutes for questions. But I know if people have to leave, I totally get it because we're on a schedule here. So thank you all for joining me.